All right, I'm very glad to be joined today on Bad Faith Podcast by Cory Doctorow, author and activist, because, Cory, I have been in positions repeatedly over the past few weeks where I've had to engage with people across the ideological spectrum about the question of inflation. What's causing inflation? Who's responsible for inflation? What kinds of spending are inflationary in their effect? And it has become clear to me that there is a lot of miscommunication about this issue, not just from conservatives or right-wing media, but very much so from liberal media as well. So I thought it might be useful for us to start by just taking on a clip that I feel like is pretty reflective of the narrative that's out there. And then we can get into dispelling, disproving, we're correcting the record and all of these kinds of things. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
Now we know. It's in the New York Times. The progressives have spelled out what they would do to fight inflation. It is dangerous economic nonsense. Congressman Ro Khanna is a California Democrat. He's a leader of the Progressive Caucus. He writes this: there is way more Biden can do to lower prices. His plan, which he writes out, it goes way over the top. He is a socialist. He demands an emergency task force to organize massive government buying of food and energy. Government buying. The government would buy wheat, corn, home heating oil, nat gas, and they would buy when the price dips. That's his word. He says the government will buy when they see a dip. So this task force would buy in massive quantities when the bureaucracy thinks it sees a price dip. What does Congressman Khanna think would happen when the government steps in with their tens of billions of dollars? The price would obviously go straight up. That's how markets work. That would be inflationary. But wait, there's more. Congressman Khanna also wants to use the National Guard and the military, quote, to address the labor shortage, whatever that means. And he wants wage subsidies for workers to offset inflation. None of these measures would lower prices. One last point about that emergency task force to do all that food buying on price dips. Congressman Khanna wants Janet Yellen on it, even though the Treasury Secretary has already admitted being wrong on inflation. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, he's failed to fix the supply chain crisis. He took maternity leave when the crisis ramped up. And then there's Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm. She's already contributed mightily to energy price inflation. This is the bureaucracy that will spring into action, reprice food and energy? Nah, it's political poison and it's economic nonsense.
So the unmitigated gall of Pete Buttigieg taking paternity leave aside.
You know, I missed the back half of that because the cerebrospinal fluid was leaking out of my ears, but I think I got the general gist.
Okay, so what does he get wrong here? Is it true? Maybe we should start with this grain. Well, no, let's start with a refresher on what has caused the inflation to begin with.
Sure. So inflation in economic terms is almost mystical because it's a sustained rise in the price level. So what does that mean? Well, how do you know when a price rise is sustained or transient? What is a price level as opposed to the price of one thing? You know, if Pokemon cards go up, we don't say we have inflation, right? So the price level is the level of goods. And so there's a lot of room for people to kind of go, well, I don't think it's sustained, or now it's sustained, or the level has gone up or the level hasn't gone up. I think that to understand the root issue of inflation, it's when people are bidding on something that there isn't enough of and the price goes up. And because your pal there from Fox News was right. When more people try to buy something, if the supply doesn't change and the demand goes up, then the price goes up too. You have bidding wars. And the question that the right likes to ask, and I think the liberal press too, is like, is there too much money in the economy trying to buy stuff? It's not a crazy question. You know, like we could say, well, when Donald Trump decided to pump trillions of dollars into the capital markets by buying junk bonds? Did it blow up the price of, among other things, Pokemon cards, but also the stock market and, rare wine and Warhol paintings and all the other things that people who have all their basic needs go out and spend money on when suddenly there's a lot of money for them? I think too much money can, in fact, cause inflation. But there's another thing that causes inflation, the other side of the supply and the demand interaction, which is how much stuff there is. Now,
and Cory, a little birdie is telling me, I seem to recall that we are in a supply chain crisis.
So that is definitely a big part of it, but I think that it would be a mistake to end it there, right? So it's definitely true. We are having a supply chain crisis. It is worth asking, how did we end up in a circumstance where the supply chain crisis is as bad as it is now? Clearly, a global pandemic was always going to cause supply chain disruptions. But how do we end up with 4 companies running all the world's shipping who persistently ignored the advice of regulators and experts who said, I know you get an economy of scale when you make the ship bigger, but eventually it's going to get caught in the Suez Canal. And they were like, no, that'll never happen, right? How did these firms end up doing this? Well, I think that, when markets become very concentrated, then they can thumb their nose at experts and regulators. They can they can claim that only they understand their industry. It's often true. If you think about the bad FCC chairman that we had under Trump, he was a Verizon lawyer, Ajit Pai. And then the good one we had under Obama, Tom Wheeler, was a cable lobbyist. Right? Because when the industry consists of 3 to 5 giant firms, really only insiders have a good picture of what's going on in it. And so, you end up with just bad regulation. You end up with firms just being able to do whatever they want. Another thing that happens when firms are really concentrated is they can jack up prices. So instead, it isn't that the prices go up just because there's not enough to go around, but prices can also go up because as the CEOs of a bunch of companies in consumer packaged goods and oil and other industries that are really closely related to the daily consumption habits of most people, they keep telling their shareholders, Americans have been told by the press to expect inflation, so we're raising prices. Not because our costs have gone up or because there's supply chain shock or because we can't get Russian gas, but because we think that this is the moment where we can raise prices without people building guillotines on our lawn.
They can launder price gouging under the guise of these expectations that there is in fact inflation.
100%. But, I think that even if these companies were held to account and forced not to price gouge, even if we'd had better regulation and we had more efficient supply chains that had a little more slack in them, we would still have a problem. And the reason we'd have a problem is because things are very brittle. And the reason things are brittle is that for 40 years, we've pursued a just-in-time financial strategy for our industries that says, the most efficient way to run an industry is to take all the capital that is fallow. So anything that's not actually producing money at any given moment and get rid of it. So, you can see this at a fast food restaurant before the Great Resignation. If you've got someone you've hired to flip burgers and no one's ordering a burger, you send them home because they're on a 0 hours contract. The problem is that if a school bus full of kids pulls up, you can't get them back again, right? So everybody understands that there are some limits to that. We've sent home all the people who make burgers, but not just all the people who make burgers. I'm speaking to you from California. After the SARS epidemic, the first one, California very wisely spent $200 million on a stockpile for pandemic preparedness. We bought a ton of ventilators. We bought a ton of N95s. We bought enough equipment to turn, I think it was 100 gymnasiums or community halls into field hospitals and 2 fully mobile field hospitals. And that cost about $5 million a year to maintain. Someone had to go and recharge the batteries, and you need to pay for warehouses, and you had to throw away the stuff that got old and whatever. And after that great financial crisis, that $5 million was no longer in the budget. So we basically gave that stuff away to save money. And, when the COVID pandemic hit, our problem wasn't that we didn't have enough money, right? Our problem was that we didn't have enough ventilators. And there are versions of that throughout the entire economy. That we decided, for example, that we should make all of our microprocessors in China and Taiwan. Used to be a lot of onshore microcontroller manufacturing. In fact, we have a whole region of California called Silicon Valley because they used to make microchips there, right? There's no silicon in Silicon Valley anymore. They don't make chips there anymore. They design them and they get them made somewhere else. So when Taiwan shuts down or China shuts down, then you just can't get the microcontrollers that you need for everything else. Those were industrial policy choices, right? Someone decided to tax advantage that. Someone decided that the tariff should be structured to encourage it. You know, all of those industrial choices that we made produced an outcome where one little thing goes wrong and the whole thing starts to fall apart, and it's very hard to put together again.
Yeah, I'm so glad you were so clear, and I'm really glad that that's out there. However, I have been making this case, and conservatives, libertarians that I've been speaking to have been coming back to me and saying, that's ridiculous. Even if that is contributing somewhat, it's obviously the case that if you continue to spend into the economy by, let's say, buying food for people, giving people some kind of gas card or gas break for these high fuel prices, you know, as, you know, Ro Khanna was advocating for by proxy in that clip, buying up grain reserves so that people can eat, that is only going to make the problem worse. What is the economist's response to that?
So I have to say, I'm not an economist. I'm someone who makes fun of economists. But that said, you know, that's not wrong, right? To say that if you don't do anything to increase production, but you give money to increase consumption, then you will get more consumption, not more production, prices will go up. But that isn't to say that there's no role for government spending or either in the short or the long term. So, you know, we've seen that like the US can Bigfoot the rest of the world by doing money creation and buying things that are scarce so that Americans can have lots of it. That's how we got our vaccines. Right? My family in Russia and England and Canada, they didn't have vaccines. We did because we outspent everybody else. We outbid them all, you know? And so it's true that, you know, if we do a lot of price subsidy, we will probably end up importing a lot of stuff to everyone else's detriment. That is, unfortunately, the American way. But there's another an American way, one that we've kind of lost, which is having a productive economy. And that's the thing that the government can have a role in, both directly and indirectly. The government can do things that we saw during the pandemic, like using defense law to go in and just tell companies what they have to make if there's a thing that we're short of. They can alter, they can pull all kinds of levers, right? So they can alter the tax advantage or the tariff structure on certain kinds of goods to encourage people to manufacture them here, to encourage investment in it. They can directly invest in it. You know, there's great books like the Entrepreneurial State by, I'm sorry, I always mispronounce her surname, Maria Mazzucato, who talks about how if you look at an iPhone, you know, everything that's exciting about an iPhone was publicly developed, right? It wasn't developed by Apple. Apple did something kind of synthetic. They took the GPS and the semiconductors and a bunch of other stuff that had been created, including the internet, at public expense, and they wrapped it up and packaged it. There is a real role for public production to increase the productive capacity. Because the other thing that guy, that Fox fella said that was wrong, or at least that he implied that was wrong, is that government spending is taxpayer dollars. Federal spending is not taxpayer dollars. Federal spending is just money creation. They don't pile up all of the tax dollars we send them, count them all, bundle them up, and then send them back out again to pay for federal programs. When you pay your taxes, when you instruct your bank to wire money to the IRS, say, the IRS just annihilates that money, right? It's transferred from one account in the Central Reserve to another, and then it goes to the Fed, and then it just disappears. Right? That money is no longer in circulation. When the Fed buys something, when the federal government spends money, they make new money. They just type zeros into a spreadsheet. Now, typing lots of zeros into a spreadsheet, if you then go on to spend it on things that aren't available in that currency, will totally cause inflation. Right? If you go out and you try to buy all of the Pokemon cards in America with public spending, the price will go up a lot. But if you use the public spending to build a Pokemon card factory because you think that there aren't enough Pokemon cards in circulation, and for some reason you've decided it should be public policy that everybody should have ready access to Pokemon, then that public spending will not be inflationary. That public spending will be will contribute to matching demand with supply.
So I guess that makes sense to me insofar as there was this earlier effort announced earlier in the month or maybe a couple of weeks ago by the Biden campaign that said it was going to use funds to help boost production, particularly I think in the meat industry, among small independent farmers outside of the four big producers that are guilty of some of the price gouging that's been criticized by the broad left. I'm curious what you make then of Ro Khanna's proposal that grain and oil be bought by the government at these dips. Do you think there's not a concern that it's inflationary, or that people are so desperate in the short term that there's a risk that people are going hungry? There was a statistic that came out today that 50% of American families now struggle to feed their kids. This is after the child tax credits have elapsed. That the need is great enough that it doesn't matter if it causes inflation. What do you think is going on there?
Well, it might be inflationary. I mean, but it's very hard to solve social problems when people are starving. Mm-hmm. I would say that if your only plan was to just print money and do nothing else to increase the productive capacity of the American food production system, that would be a disaster. But I don't think that's the what anyone's proposing here. And, you mentioned concentration in meat packing. We have concentration across the ag market. And one of the things that we know about that concentration is that it is inefficient in terms of overall production. It's very efficient for their shareholders, but it's inefficient in terms of how well it uses the land, because one of the things that large firms do is they suck up subsidies that allows them to use and discard land, right? Render land uninhabitable because it's cheaper for them to move on than it is to be good stewards of the land. So we see an increasing amount of the arable land in the world and in the U.S. disappearing. We also know that they have these inefficient practices that sort of keep the workforce on this very subsistence basis, this very precarious basis. So there's a term from labor economics called chickenization that refers to the practices of the chicken industry. So there's three big chicken companies in America, chicken processors. And like the cable operators and the phone companies, they've divided up America so that if you're a phone customer, if you want to get a landline or if you want to get a DSL line, there's generally speaking only one phone company in your neighborhood. If you want to get cable, there's only one cable company. If you're a chicken farmer, there's only one company that'll buy your chickens within range of it. And they treat you as an independent contractor. They claim that you're an independent contractor, but they arrange every single aspect of your working life. So they tell you what kind of chicken coop you have to buy. They tell you who's allowed to maintain it. They tell you when the lights go on and when they get turned off, what kind of food you have to buy, where you have to buy from, which vets you can use, what medicine they can use, and so on. And they sell you the birds. And then you raise them. They tell you everything in advance except for how much they're going to pay you for the chickens. And then when you bring your chickens to market, they use their bird's eye view of all of the chicken farmers and all the markets and all the retailers to pay you just enough that you can service your loans and raise another crop of chickens. And if they change their priorities, they just put you out of business. And because this cartel has got the market sewn up, when chicken farmers speak out against it, they just lose their contracts. And in fact, famously, one farmer who lost his contract went into chicken coop maintenance. And the big processors told all the farmers who served them, if you hire this guy to maintain your chicken coop, we're not going to buy your birds either. So this is a really, not only is this kind of cruel and awful, it's basically, if you don't live somewhere rural, you're probably familiar with Uber drivers who have effectively the same arrangement. You buy the car and you're told where to drive and all the rest of it. You don't find out how much you're going to get paid until you drop your fare off. But it's also happening in agriculture. And while turning our cities' transportation systems into a dysfunctional mess is really bad, doing it with our food supply is really, really, really bad. And, this inefficiency is good for the shareholders of these three large firms, but it's bad for us. John Deere has been waging war on farmers' ability to fix their tractors for a decade. They use an obscure copyright law called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. It's a 1998 law that Bill Clinton signed. And under Section 12.1 of this law, if you remove copy protection, you commit a felony. And so what they've done is they've put copy protection around the software for the tractor. So if you want to, if you put a new part in your tractor and you want the tractor to start running with that new part, you have to get around the copy protection. And there's two ways of doing that. One is you wait 2 days for their technician to come out and type an unlock code into the tractor that you've already fixed, or you commit a felony by bypassing this. So we have farmers who can't bring the crops in because we have a monopoly big ag company that is abusing copyright law to decide who can fix tractors. So, this brittleness in our food supply and these inefficiencies in our food supply are real problems. Now, all of that said, maintaining a buffer stock of commodities is not a new idea, and it's not intrinsically inflationary. It's, there have been granaries that held buffer stocks since Babylonian times. Right.
Yeah, this is what I was wondering, if perhaps Ro Khanna's idea is to liberate, not to actually put more kind of stress on supply, but that there are these supplies because there are buffer stocks, and simply use government money to distribute it more efficiently. Would that necessarily be inflationary if that's the case? Well,
it's only inflationary if there are other people trying to buy it at the same time. Mm-hmm. So say there's someone else who maintains a buffer stock, right? Say there's food banks that maintain buffer stocks and do a lot of careful watching of staple prices and go out and buy lots of that stuff. Well, now you're driving up the price of that the food banks have. I mean, it is the argument that the right makes that the economy is big and complicated and weird, and it's very hard to know in advance what effects your actions are going to have. It's not wrong. The part that's wrong is the counsel of despair, the nihilism that emerges from that, where we say, well, the economy is big and weird, so we should just do nothing, right? The largest companies in the world, companies like Walmart and Amazon, they're on the same order of magnitude of scale as the Soviet Union was in 1989. And like the Soviet Union, they are planned economies. And nobody says, why isn't Amazon a marketplace? How come when you get a job at Amazon, Commissar Bezos has one of his sub-commissars give you a job and tell you how to execute the 5-year plan? Why aren't you going into Amazon and bidding on what desk you're going to have and how many pencils you're going to get? And you've got a little spot market with a market maker who's got the supply cabinet, all sewn up. Like, how come we don't do it that way? The reason we don't do it that way is there's a certain amount of planning that is efficient. Technology has made a degree of planning possible that wasn't possible before. And, these people who stand for these giant multinational corporations that are as big as countries rather, who stand for the unilateral authority of the people who run them, but then say that governments are incapable of intervening without destroying things. They're not just like wrong, they're also incoherent.
Yeah, because this is the thing. You said that the conservatives are arguing that the government is big and complicated, so we should, they have this nihilistic approach. I would almost argue that they're not saying that the government is big and complicated. They're saying that they understand it perfectly. They know exactly what causes inflation. It's any kind of government spending, and that we should not therefore do any kind of government spending. And they're basically the same way that these corporations are using inflation to grandfather in exploitation, price gouging. Conservatives are using inflation to shoehorn in what is their forever agenda, which is to limit government spending. And Democrats haven't quite figured out what the counter narrative is. And it seems like there are some opportunities. And I want to ask you about this. It seems to me that there is an interesting amount of bipartisan frustration with the amount of spending on military aid to Ukraine as compared to some of the domestic crises that are ongoing. And people on both sides of the aisle are now talking about, in frustrated tones, why it is that we seem to be able to come up with $40 billion to send to Ukraine, or another however $1 million to spend on these rocket launchers that went out last week, but not enough money to do gas subsidies or pay for food or whatever it is. And I'm curious whether or not there is any difference between the inflationary effect of military spending and the inflationary effect on a hypothetical food or gas spend.
So I think military spending, I'm not a fan of military spending. I grew up in the peace movement. I'd be happy zeroing out military budgets. That'd be fine with me. But I have to say that I don't think it's wildly inflationary. I think that The actual underlying raw materials are just not that great. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of steel and microchips and whatever, but on the scale of the nation, it's just not that much. Even when you count the battleships and the aircraft carriers. What is more, I think that there is like a kind of moral position to say we're willing to do money creation for tanks, but not bread. That is it does speak loudly to the moral priorities of the society we live in. And then I think the other kind of inflation that arises from this is asset inflation, because you can think of military spending as a pass-through from the Federal Reserve to billionaires, right? The shareholders in military companies.
So Joe Biden goes down, 2 weeks ago to the Lockheed Martin factory in, what was it, Alabama or Arkansas? I forget which.
Yes, not Burbank, where it used to be. I am living on the ashes of the Lockheed Martin empire here in Burbank. We were a company town. They moved to non-union places outside of California.
Right. So he goes down, he visits, he makes a big speech. He talks about how Americans should be so proud about how we're spending all of this money on Ukraine, and then goes back home. And it seems to be an obvious articulation of the priorities going on there. And it's hard for me to understand, I guess, if military spending is whatever it is, $750 billion, whatever it is, a huge chunk of the U.S. budget, why it is that is not having any kind of effect when Republicans are pointing, rightly or wrongly, to COVID spending as being the root cause of all of the inflation that we're seeing now.
Well, I think that this is an area where Kana was actually pretty right on. So one of the places in which there is some inflationary pressure from military spending is in labor markets, because the Pentagon's the largest employer in America. Right? I'm actually going for my citizenship exam tomorrow. At the federal building here in LA. And one of the questions on the flashcards they give you is, what kind of economy is America? And my wife has been drilling me, and I always say mixed market economy. And she says, no, it says capitalist economy. I'm like, it can't be a capitalist economy if the largest employer is a public agency. I'm sorry, that is at the very least a mixed market economy. So there is a lot of, actual labor that has been reserved by the US government for military spending. Through military spending for military operations. So Kana's not wrong to say, like, we've got a bunch of people who are not available to whatever it is we need done, whether that's helping increase our food supply or smoothing out delivery issues or whatever. A lot of that has just been sidelined. Now, America also has a lot of extremely underemployed people who could be doing much more efficient work as well. Like, we don't, I think that even if the military were never mobilized to help with this, we could just solve a lot of this problem by giving truckers a decent wage and decent working conditions, so that so that they weren't spending 16 hours in a port just like waiting for a log jam to clear. We could get a lot of that stuff, and throwing more people at that doesn't solve it. It's a matter of getting more labor power so that the people who do the job can tell their bosses to go to hell when they ask them to do it in this inefficient way, and then absorb the prices, right? Absorb the cost.
Yeah, I mean, I'm listening to you talk, and I'm hearing a bunch of, they're not talking points, but I would argue that they should be talking points to the extent that they sound like they have incredibly broad appeal, including appeal to this kind of phantom working class white Midwestern voter that the Democratic Party seems to be so interested in, but does very little to actually court in terms of material terms. So you're saying give truckers more money, break up big ag so that farmers aren't in a vice grip when it comes to fixing their own trucks, or aren't being sued by Monsanto for planting a seed that blew in from the field next door. Biden's initiative from a few weeks ago to support small meat farmers, ask people to make stuff. That seems to me to be a really #American approach to this kind of problem. But I'm not hearing that kind of messaging coming out of the West. It is true that Biden did the thing. Biden is supporting small meat farmers. To what do you attribute that kind of rhetorical and cognitive gap there? Because Republicans, on the other hand, aren't offering anything at all. They're just wadding down left ideas.
So look, I think that you and I probably both agree that the Democratic Party is an uneasy coalition. And Biden is not great at figuring out how to balance it out, but he has made some really good choices. I have to say this as someone who donated to almost everybody who campaigned against Biden in the primary. So I'm giving him his props, not because I'm an OG Biden fan here. But, if you look at what he's done in antitrust, which I would argue is the foundational task of reforming America, because to go back to what we were talking about at the start of this, monopoly means that companies don't have to listen to their regulators. Monopoly means that companies can raise prices. Monopoly means that companies can abuse their workers. Monopolies mean that they don't have to worry about the externalities like pollution and so on. So without and the externalities that we're really engaged with now, which is like making all the microchips in China, getting all the gas from Russia and so on, right? Monopoly is like if we don't solve monopoly, we can't do the rest of it because we can't regulate. If an industry is like 5 giant companies, they all know each other. They're like godparents to each other's kids. They're married to each other. It's really easy for them to figure out what their lobbying priorities are. They see each other at Little League games and they speak with one voice. If an industry is like 1,000 SMEs, they won't even be able to agree on how to cater their annual meeting, which means that you will have space for regulators to gather actual evidence and act on it. And in antitrust, we have seen an amazing, revolutionary, world-changing action from the White House. And I think they don't want to talk about it because they know that there's people in the coalition who aren't happy about it. But putting Tim Wu in the White House, Wu wrote a 72-point executive order on antitrust, and it's a beauty to behold. It came out last July, and each point is like, so I'm an activist. I've done technical activism for 20 years, and every person like me has got this thing where it's like, there's this one regulation that if we were only to enforce it or change the way it was enforced in this one way that you absolutely have authority to do, we could do something radical. It's 72 of those. It's like, the federal government will, exercise its authority under the 1850 Meatpacking and Safety Act to do an X and Y and Z and so on. They're on track to do all 72 of them. Lena Khan, who's running the FTC, 4 years ago was a radical law student who changed the world with a paper called Amazon's Antitrust Paradox in the Yale Law Review. Now she's running the Federal Trade Commission, the most powerful consumer agency in the world. And she is being an absolutely amazing barn-burning radical. She's calling for merger scrutiny. She's calling for unwinding mergers. There was this orgy of mergers in the run-up to her taking office. And all these companies were like, oh, let's get in before the new stern schoolmarm arrives. And she's like, yeah, you did all that while like I was getting my desk unpacked. I saw you do it, and I'm going to go back and investigate all of those mergers now. And then Jonathan Cantor at the DOJ is channeling, of all people, James Comey. That I'm not a big fan of James Comey, but his one shining moment was when he asked federal prosecutors when he took over the Southern District. He said, how many of you have never lost a case? And they all stick their hand up, and he goes, you guys are the chicken shit club, because you won't take on a case that you can't win. You won't take on a hard case. Jonathan Cantor is calling the whole DOJ antitrust division the chicken shit club and saying, we're going to fight the big hard cases now. So it's amazing what's going on there. And I think they don't want to go around and trumpet it, even though it is popular, because it's not popular with some of the donors and it's not popular with elements of the coalition.
Well, also to the extent, credit where credit's due, but to the extent that we're talking about things that can actually address inflation in the short term that people are thinking about, especially since we're talking about really in the midterm cycle, rightly or wrongly, that's what people politically are geared toward. It doesn't seem like those kind of interventions are going to have that effect. So you have I said earlier that Republicans aren't offering anything. That's not entirely true. What they're really pushing for, again, is to open up more oil drilling and to basically push the long-term agenda, which, by the way, Biden has acquiesced on. But none of that stuff is going to do anything in the short term either. It takes 5-10 years to ramp that stuff up. And a lot of people on the left, in all fairness, are saying, well, let's use this moment to advocate for green technologies, building solar panels and whatnot, but for the same kinds of supply chain issues we described before, where microchips are made in Silicon Valley. We've completely abdicated our ability to be any kind of leader on solar panels. And none of that can happen locally without the same supply chain issues and cost issues in any near future term either. So what is the response to folks who are very frustrated about, let's say, high oil prices right now? Who would you point the finger at in terms of blame, and what would you advocate as a policy response?
Well, with oil prices, and gas as well, the actual crude prices are low. It's the forward contracts that are expensive. So this is financial engineering, right? So the prices are grounded in the anticipated price in 6 months. They're not grounded because they're locking in prices in advance using these futures contracts. And, most people, when you say futures contracts, their eyes glaze over because it's this super technical thing. And that's fine, right? If I try to explain, when I drive a car, I don't know anything about maintaining a car. When my car doesn't work and the mechanic explains it, I try to follow along, but same thing. Like it's not my area of expertise. I'm sure I could understand it if I wanted to put my energy into it. There's only so many hours in the day, but I trust him, right? The only time I get angry at my mechanic is when I go get my car fixed and it still doesn't work. And so if we let these economists create these financial markets that were supposed to smooth out consumption and smooth out prices and de-risk production of capital-intensive industries, and it's produced this, then I think we go to them and we say, like, okay, you guys have demonstrated that all your mumbo-jumbo doesn't have any footing to it. It works well, but it fails badly. When there aren't any supply chain problems, it turns out that you can do a bunch of weird, irrational things and it'll all be fine. But the test is what happens when the supply chain breaks. Do these safety measures actually work? And, this is true, I think, of all of the financial innovation that we've seen, in this century. And I use financial innovation in the technical sense, which is to say unregulated securities, because that's financial innovation is really just a way of taking something you're not allowed to do, calling it something else, and doing it. And over and over again, we've seen that the hedged positions that were supposed to allow for much more credit to buy houses in the run-up to the great financial crisis were wrong. We've seen it now with the efficiencies that were supposed to be realized through supply chain and just-in-time and lean methodologies. And we see it with the futures markets, where the futures markets are producing a failure. And if all you've got when the futures market fails is we're just going to have to market harder, we're just going to have to do capitalism more, because the problem is that we just haven't capitalist enough, then I think you don't sound very credible. And I think that is a moment where we can step in and say, let's not rely exclusively on forward contracts to figure out how to allocate something that if you don't have it, everyone freezes to death.
Well, I guess I'm a little confused about how things would be different absent these future contracts. Because it does seem like even if it's not happening now, there is a supply chain crisis coming down the pike as a consequence of the sanctions on Russian oil and the failure of Saudi Arabia to want to play ball, as it were, as Biden had hoped.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely true. And, there's this old joke from Ireland, if you wanted to get there, I wouldn't start from here. Right. It's not like the fact that the Saudis have a chokehold on the world's oil supply is a surprise. Right. Jimmy Carter found that out.
Right.
So if in the time between Carter and now, both Democrats and Republicans have failed to address this, then, that is a fact of life that is somewhat inescapable. Right. I mean, we can't go back and fix it. We can reckon with it. We can look at the ideology that said that we could kick the can down the road. But, we are here now. And I think that in the absence of futures contracts, you could see things like what Kana is proposing, right? Where you have direct purchases, you have direct allocation, something a little like what we saw with N95 masks during the lockdown, where, we had stopped producing them onshore, we had sold off our supplies of them or given them away, and there was just no way to unwind that, right? You could not go back in time and rebuild the California pandemic preparedness, hoard. And so you just had to do the second best thing, which was to do direct allocations by need. And, again, I think that would be politically very unpopular. I think it might also be the right way to do it. I mean, the alternative, if there's not enough oil and gas and you need oil and gas to get stuff done, is to just allow the high bidder to have it. And the theory of markets is that the high bidder will be the person who needs it the most.
Which is
but that theory... Yeah, well, it assumes that everyone has approximately the same amount of money, or that if you have more money than everyone else, it's because you're right more than they are. And
that willingness to pay equals ability to pay.
Yeah. Yeah. So, there was an NBER paper in March about whether firms run by people with this outlook do better than others. They examined specifically whether firms run by people with MBAs do better than others. And what they found is that the firms actually perform pretty much the same. They sell the same amount of goods. They have their marketing campaigns work about as well. Their new product launches are about as good. The one difference is that companies run by MBAs don't pay their workers as much. And so they're more profitable. And so all that stuff that is supposed to be, the magic secret sauce that's supposed to produce efficient market outcomes that you learn in B school about financial engineering and, cool marketing techniques and incredibly streamlined management stuff. It turns out that all of it is just a thin scrim on, moving more money from the labor side of the ledger to management side of the ledger and shareholder side of the ledger.
Is this a moment where people should be arguing that we should just nationalize the oil industry?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I am not an oil markets expert. I think that countries that have nationalized their oil industry, so in Canada, where Petro-Canada was a crown corporation when I was a kid, it didn't produce wise management. It just produced a country whose stakeholders were really committed to oil extraction to the exclusion of things like indigenous rights. So I don't know. I mean, I would much rather see, if we're going to do something, if we're going to dream big and we're going to imagine, some big radical interventions, I would much rather see a national program of scaling up renewables production and battery production, a moonshot.
We're still in this crisis point. I mean, we're still in this conversational back and forth where this needs to be a conversation about the short term. And I know that feels frustrating because we're all in agreement about all the things that can do, even a lot of the Republican plans, even though I don't agree with them ideologically because of, climate change, they would work. But are we really saying that literally nothing is possible to cure this crisis in the short term?
Well, could we make N95s appear after we got rid of them?
I mean, we could and did in a relatively short term cycle, not short enough given the needs of a pandemic, buy them from somewhere else. Now, what the effects were on the market of where we bought them from. Not great. Sorry, rest of the world. But politically speaking, if we can put morals and ethics to the side for a second, is that a thing that is possible? Or should people be saying things like maybe we should be advocating for a quicker end to the conflict in Ukraine instead of sending weapons there that are not going to cause Ukraine to be able to defeat nuclear power Russia, but will prolong the conflict?
I mean, speaking as someone of both Russian and Ukrainian background whose family in Russia are trying to figure out how to leave the country, a swift resolution to that would be just fine as far as I'm concerned. I have to say, I was among the people who, in the run-up to it, thought that the risk sounded overblown, and since then has found myself, on the one hand, appalled by what's going on, and on the other hand, feeling like I am, that the information warfare domain of it is so intense that I am unable to form an opinion about how the war is actually going. Like, I honestly have no idea. And I think anyone who claims that they know it, who isn't on the ground or who isn't spending every hour God sends on it, is probably overconfident, kidding themselves.
I think that's probably right. But the experts that have come on this show so far have all pointed out just the basic truth that we're talking about a nuclear power versus Ukraine. And even if Ukraine valiantly is able to win a bunch of battles and claw back territory, there's also always the possibility that if push comes to shove, Russia can do what it uniquely has the power to do in the context of those two countries.
I mean, again, I'm not a Russia-Ukraine expert. I did spend the first half of my life in the anti-nuclear proliferation movement. I am skeptical that Russians would enjoy being downwind of a Ukrainian nuclear annihilation. So.
Well, one of the experts we had on was talking about how there's been this mass proliferation of tinier nukes. Nukes have gotten smaller over time with the idea that it makes it more easy to actually use them. Also, it makes it easier to avoid some of the public blowback that's going to come from having used a nuclear weapon, and that there's this perverse minification of nukes as a consequence. Yeah,
I mean that it has been the the boondoggle of nuclear weapons since the beginning. I went on a PR tour of Cheyenne Mountain once during the Clinton years when there was the peace dividend, and they were worried that they were going to shut down NORAD, and they were trying to get as many people to come and visit it, and then write to their members of parliament and their members of Congress to urge them to keep spending for it. And the first thing they tell you is, before we broke ground on this hollow mountain that we all work in every day, someone invented cobalt bombs, which would have left enough radiation in the air for long enough that being in the mountain wouldn't help. And so the mountain was useless before we started building it, but we already had the appropriations, so we just kept on building it. I mean, this is the problem of, this is why we say, oh, it's going nuclear and so on, is because we don't know how to use it. But to drag it back, maybe I'm just despairing here, but I think that we slept on stuff that was pretty obvious for a long time, and we've arrived at a place where all we're doing is considering a bunch of bad answers to wonder which one is least worst. And
so maybe Roe wasn't wrong then. Maybe Roe has come to this conclusion where maybe it's, some of these things are inflationary, but you, one, got to win an election, and two, or I should reverse the order of those in terms of priority, but two, got to make sure children don't starve.
Yeah.
And it is what it is.
And the other thing that's happening with energy transition is, in addition to China being in lockdown, and so the energy transition slowing down because the production there, and although a lot of it is nominally made in Vietnam or whatever, but to avoid the Trump sanctions, is that Europe is bidding up the price of, speaking of inflation, bidding up the price of solar panels, because Europeans woke up one day and they said, oh, if we wanted to get there, I wouldn't starve from here. Like, it turns out that that just listening to the people who told us that we could just safely rely on Russian gas and oil and didn't have to affect a transition, those people were wrong. And we are now in a position where there's no good way to resolve this. And so we're just picking the least bad way and getting ready for a lot of pain. I mean, look, I think like the pandemic, this supply chain crisis is a preview of the kinds of hard choices that we're going to come up against in the climate emergency. I think that the climate emergency is going to produce big shocks that, in not even in hindsight, right now we can see coming, but that we will not get past the point of peak indifference before we get past the point of no return. That by the time people agree that there's something we need to do about it, it'll be too late to have a graceful transition. I think that's already the case in a lot of our climate, coming climate consequences. And, the grace with which we handle these hard choices and our willingness to do things that are risky because the alternative is even riskier, that is going to be a real predictor of what is to come. And I try not to be a downer, but this feels like a down moment, given all that you've said and all that I've said and all that Rokana said and all that charming gentleman from Fox News said,
Well, look, I it's true. It's a downer, but I still do think there is something optimistic, rightly or wrongly, about the idea of America doing things like direct delivery of food and services. I know a lot of people were critical of China's lockdown, saying they were overly harsh, and draconian and all of these kinds of things. But I was reading a study recently about people's perceptions internally in various nations of how democratic their own countries were. And Chinese people perceive their country to be very democratic. And they're like number 1 on the list, and we're like number 37. And it's because, in part, Americans equate democracy with elections, and we have all this skepticism and about the failure of our electoral processes and the undemocratic nature of the Senate and all these other kinds of things. Whereas in China, the emphasis is less on that and more on what the government is able to deliver for you. And when I see these food deliveries being dropped off and the hospitals being built in days and all of that kind of stuff that goes on in China, it's partly because they're able to do things for structural reasons that I wouldn't necessarily want in the United States, but are still the feat that deserves a certain amount of appreciation. It makes me wonder how much more faith in government and how democratic we would feel if we had some demonstration of the government being able to come through in a pinch and say, here's a gas card, here's some food, even if there are short-term consequences.
It's true that might make people feel like there's a possibility of hope that something can happen. I'm not a big one for optimism. I think optimism is just kind of fatalistic, like things are just going to get better, so we don't need to do anything. But I'm a big one for hope. You know, the idea that if we do stuff, we can make stuff better. And you might be right. I mean, one of the unheralded stories of what happened in China in their pandemic response was they suspended debt payments from firms to banks. They just shut down the need to, we had an eviction moratorium, and we had, some mortgage relief around the edges, but they just said, small businesses, they don't have to pay rent. They don't have to, and then their landlords don't have to pay mortgages. And, we're just going to hit pause here, because if we allow the small businesses to rack up a year's worth of rent arrears, then when the lights turn on again, all of those businesses will go bust. And so we won't have, going back to inflation is a function of how much money you have and how much stuff you can buy with that money. China understands that if you don't have businesses, if the businesses all go bust because they couldn't pay their rent because everything was in lockdown, then there won't be anything to buy. And then that will be inflationary in the really bad way, right? The way where it's not just price gouging, but even if you solve the price gouging, people are not going to have enough to meet their basic needs. And, that is the result of putting the state in front of finance, or putting the public good in front of finance. When we talk about financialism and a finance economy and a financial political system, that's really what we mean. Because it is inconceivable, really, to think that the commercial landlords of America would have been told, I'm sorry, you can't collect rent from your tenants, but to the banks, you can't collect mortgages from your commercial landlords. That's just inconceivable. And yet, it is clearly a very good policy, because if what you end up with is a bunch of commercial evictions and the shutdowns of SMEs, nobody benefits. The banks don't benefit. The commercial landlords don't benefit. Nobody benefits from that.
Yeah, it's not efficient. I really appreciate the conversation about efficiencies, because I am no economist, obviously, and got through college without ever taking a single econ course. However, I did have a law and economics professor that I talk about from time to time on this show that was a Marxist. He was like a leftist that snuck into the law and economics.
He was a leftist
department.
law and econ. Did you go to
Correct.
Chicago?
I have no. I feel like there's no left. They've purged every leftist from the University of Chicago. I went to Harvard Law, and Harvard. this guy, he wins a Teacher of the Year every year, and he's a real delightful guy, John Hansen. And he introduced a lot of these concepts about efficiencies and product liability law, and how forcing companies to externalize their harms creates all of these downstream market effects that are beneficial to society, and how far our legal structure could go toward making a more just world. And I do think that even though I am not a capitalist, talking to people, trying to communicate with people who do have this confidence in markets, being able to explain to them that even in their own system, these efficiencies exist that are driving bad outcomes, is really useful. And so I appreciate you talking in those terms.
There's a great economist. He calls himself the cowboy economist. His name's John T. Harvey. And his shtick is he has this YouTube channel where he puts on a belt buckle the size of a dinner plate and a cowboy hat. And he really, really thickens up his accent. And he does homespun, MMT economics. It's really, they're great little videos. And one of the things he says is, if you hired a carpenter and you said, look, I got to stick this board to this board, and the carpenter took a look at it and said, the only way we can do that is with a screw, and screws are for communists. I only use nails, right? You would fire that carpenter. And, likewise, if you hired somebody who said, that's a nail job, and here in the People's Republic of Carpinteria, we only use screws, you would fire them too. It's absolutely true that when you give people personal advantage to realizing efficiencies, they do. There was a great, I think it was another MBR paper written by these Bank of Canada economists who IKEA catalog hoarders, and their spouses said, you need to do something with those IKEA catalogs. Get them out of the attic, get them out of the garage. You can't just keep them around. Do something with them. So they did a study. And what they looked at was, what are the predictors of a SKU, of a single item remaining in the IKEA catalog over a long time scale? And what they found is that if a thing remains in the IKEA catalog over a long time scale, year on year, it gets lighter, it has fewer countries of origin, and it ships in a smaller box because they figured out a more efficient way to pack it and decompose it. So the 2 Billy bookcases you have on the wall, one of which you bought when you first got in your apartment and one of which you bought during the lockdown to hold all the books you read, they look identical, but the second one's like a third lighter. It has less embodied energy. It has less embodied material. It costs less to ship. It was logistically less complicated. It is a completely different object that fills the same function. And that's a thing markets can do. It's also a thing non-market mechanisms can do. But there are times where creating market incentives drives people to go and do incredible things, in the same way that, like, I'm not a competitive sports person. I have a bad back and I swim every day in the public pool across the street. And I'm always upset when I get in a lane with someone who's almost my speed or a little faster, a little slower, because we end up kind of racing and it makes me crazy. But I'm willing to stipulate that competing makes athletes do incredible things. I just don't want it to be the only organizing principle in my life.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what socialism actually means. And there's always someone who wants to give you a gotcha, like, but didn't you get to choose your lipstick color? And under socialism, there's only one lipstick and all of this kind of stuff. And people who know a lot more than I do, and, my friend Nathan Robinson likes to talk about market socialism and things like that. And it is frustrating, because I think that anyone with common sense understands that. And yet you get these cartoonish depictions of socialism, and also how apparently Joe Biden's a socialist and everyone's a socialist, and it becomes nonsensical. The last question
I never see him at the meetings.
Right. He takes off his hammer and sickle hat before he gets on TV every day.
Yeah.
But the one other thing I wanted to ask you was, you just said MMT a few minutes ago, and I thought it was remarkable that you got through this whole conversation without explicitly saying MMT, because I find myself in this position where I know that my understanding of the world and the arguments that I'm making on the Hill, for instance, in a bipartisan context with the Libertarian co-host, are informed by my understanding of how the country's budget is not like a household budget. Dollars are spent into existence and taxes aren't paying for any of this. However, I know that if I say MMT or make any explicit reference to that, I'm going to be told that I am doing, hocus pocus voodoo econ, and all of my credibility goes right out the window. And I wonder what you make of that and what your approach is to having these conversations.
It's a bit like socialist, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a word that we didn't used to use, and now people use more. Mm-hmm. And clearly, like, if you can convince people not to use the word that describes the thing that they believe, then you hamstring them, because they have to spend a lot of time tap dancing around what they believe. MMT, like, at its when you get really into the weeds, when you're reading Randall Wray and Steve Keen and the rest of them, it's a complicated idea, right? It has a very simple overview, but like, how does MMT play into Forex markets? This is a very complicated idea. Where does MMT sit in relation to inflation targeting and interest rate setting at central banks, right? Like, these are really complicated ideas. They're hard to follow. And I think most of us who have a general idea that MMT is good don't get deep into the weeds. I think most of the people who think MMT is bad also don't get deep into the weeds. I've heard left critiques of MMT that it only works if you're rich, right? It only works if you're a rich country. And, MMT economists from the global south, like Fidel Kaboub, would I think beg to differ. They've written extensive work on this, and they have case studies, and there are lots of instances where it has worked. So I think that the cursory understanding, or the place where people go awry with MMT, is in the kind of discussion we were having just a little while ago, which is like, should the government nationalize the oil companies, or should they just buy all the companies' oil, right? These are at root MMT questions, right? And they have very difficult to understand ripple effects. They're very hard to predict. I don't know. When you asked me that, my blood went a little cold because I'm like, I don't know. Right? I really don't.
I've done an episode on it. People can go back and listen to those experts give their opinion on the previous episode.
Sure. But, within MMT, there are these ideas for automatic stabilizers, for things where state spending is not spent on this kind of one-off basis in these big spectacular undertakings like nationalizing all the oil companies or just buying all their excess output during price dips. Those are things like the jobs guarantee, where you spend money into the economy when there are people who don't have jobs. And when those people do have jobs, they quit their jobs guarantee jobs, and you don't have to spend that money anymore. And you're spending enough because the private sector hasn't started offering more and tempting people out of those jobs. And so the private sector is not strong enough to do that. It needs that public intervention. There are some hard technical questions, like how do you have enough shovel-ready jobs to do that? And Pavlina Cherneva has done really good work explaining how that would work. So when people raise that objection, you can say, Pavlina's work, she's written very accessible short books about it, and you don't have to read long academic papers. And there are ideas out of MMT that don't require this thing where we're playing SimCity and we go, okay, I'm gonna tell everybody that they're not allowed to put a second story on their house this week because I need the concrete to build a new national highway system because we can't ramp up concrete production in time and we need the concrete for this, right? Like that kind of wartime rationing, which, I think the right will point out, not entirely wrongly, also drives black markets, although black markets aren't the be all and end all. Wartime rationing did happen. Again, I speak to you from the birthplace of Lockheed Martin, where we built a lot of goddamn airplanes because there was rationing.
And people were proud of it. People were, we speak in glowing terms of the idea of a World War II level ramping up of stuff. Yeah. We talked in those terms during COVID. There are always consequences. Like, this is the thing that makes me crazy. I'm not saying to be flippant about the consequences or not really think through to make sure the cost benefit is going to work out. But so often the reality of there being kind of winners and losers in policymaking is used as an excuse to maintain a status quo in which there are also winners and losers. And it's a giant trolley problem, and it's exhausting.
Yeah, and I think that's key, that the winners of the current system are not considered to be beneficiaries of the system.
Right.
They're just considered to be the natural winners.
Right.
And so anything that changes that is exacting a penalty. As opposed to withdrawing a premium.
Right.
And that is true. I mean, I think that, I know that I have a hammer and everything looks like a nail, but I think the scale of the energy industries and the fact that really the people who understand their internal functioning mostly are partisans for the industry. They're either, current executives or former executives of the industry, makes resolving these questions really hard. It's a bit like trying to regulate how Facebook runs its operations. Like, to a first approximation, everybody who knows how Facebook's server infrastructure works is a Facebook employee. So if you order Facebook to do something and they say, we did it, and it doesn't work, how do you find out whether they were dragging their heels or whether you just asked them to do something that turned out to be technically more challenging than you anticipated?
Right.
And this is why I think we have to, that whatever efficiencies we get from having firms that are very large, and there are some efficiencies to very large firms, that we need to understand that they are offset by the inability to administer policy in relation to them, and a kind of helplessness that emerges from it, where you have these absolutely vital sectors where there can be no public accountability, because whenever you try to tell them you should be doing X or Y, they say, well, it's just technically impossible.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I have nothing to add to that. I really appreciate you coming to talk to me.
Oh,
You're
it's my pleasure.
Incredibly clear. We've had Professor Fidel Kabuba on the show as well, and he is also one of the clearest articulators.
Well, he's not
of
even
this kind
speaking
of...
his first language, so he's way clearer than me. Yeah.
But you guys are both rock stars as far as I'm concerned, and I hope to see you around in all of the media context because everyone needs to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you. I'll be a citizen in about a week and I'll get to vote. So
are you sure? Are you sure that's what you want, Cory?
Oh, I'm so sure. Being a permanent resident of the United States without being a citizen has all the disadvantages, but none of the human rights. So yes, there has never been a time at which people who live in this country need the full slate of human rights available to them more than now. So 100%.
And you said your wife is American?
She's British.
Oh, she's
British. But she got her U.S. citizenship as well. So
okay, well, she's American.
Yes, yes.
You know.
So but just a few months ago. So yes,
sure.
But she's British by birth. So
and can you guys maintain your British and Canadian citizenship just in case things go down?
I'm a triple, or I will be. My daughter's a triple. My grandfather was born in what is now Belarus, but was then Poland. And we're trying to figure out how to get his posthumous papers so that my dad can become a Pole and then I can become a Pole so that we can get back into the EU if we need to. And my dad
it's good to have options. Yeah, go ahead.
My dad was born in Azerbaijan. His parents were army deserters. And I once met an Azerbaijani official and he said, you should get an Azerbaijani passport. I was like, I don't know where that gets me into. I've got the Canadian passport.
Everyone needs options. Look, I don't want to give the government my DNA, but to the extent that 23andMe can give me some clarity about where my ancestors came from, that's the best case made for it I can think of. Can you tell people, though, where to find more of you in your work in case they want to read your writings and such?
I'm a novelist and writer, and so I have about 20 books, young adult novels, young books for middle grades readers, nonfiction books, nonfiction policy books, adult novels, short story collections, and so on. And so if you just type Cory Doctorow into your favorite bookseller, you'll find all of those. I write when I'm anxious, so I have 8 books in production right now.
Oh my gosh.
The next one is called Choke Point Capitalism. It's coming out with Rebecca Giblin from Beacon in the fall. We just got blurbs from David Dian and Margaret Atwood, which is a very exciting pairing. I don't think anyone else has ever gotten that.
That's very
And it's
cool.
about monopsony and creative labor markets, why giving artists more copyright won't give them more money if all the copyright industries are controlled by the same 3 or 4 firms, and what else we can do to make that work. I have a daily blog and newsletter called Pluralistic. If you go to pluralistic.net, you can get it as Twitter threads, as Mastodon threads, as Medium posts, as Tumblr posts, as an email list, or on a blog with an RSS feed. So your choice.
Well done. Look, we're going to have you back to talk about, isn't Disney's copyright up to expire in a year or so? The Mickey Mouse
some
copyright?
Of the early Mouse stuff is about to expire. And what's even more interesting that's in our book is copyright termination. So after 30 years since the 1976 Copyright Act, people can terminate their copyright assignments. And so, like, for example, the heirs of all the Marvel creators, like Stan Lee, are telling Disney they want their characters back. The guy who wrote the article Top Gun is based on terminated Paramount's license to it, and Paramount made the movie anyway, and he's suing. Termination's wild. George Clinton terminated his whole catalog and took it back. All the Babysitter Club's books are being published by their author now, not by her former publisher. She gets 100% of the revenue. Same with Sweet Valley High. And so we are so this was a 76 Act. We are now in the sweet spot for termination. And there is like mass terminations underway. I'm on the advisor of a nonprofit called Authors Alliance that helps academic authors terminate their licenses to big, high cost scholarly journals so that they can put them into open access journals.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah.
That's definitely a whole episode or 2 in there. So I look forward to having you back on the podcast. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Nice talking to you.
Nice talking to you as well. And to all of our listeners, this is a free episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Just as a reminder, we also put out a Monday premium episode, and you can subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month and unlock the whole back catalog of, it's got to be over 60 or 70 episodes at this point. So if you enjoy this and want to support the pod, it's much appreciated. Otherwise, take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.